Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. It was a Friday night, one of those perfect evenings where you have no obligations, no responsibilities, just time to kill. A couple of my friends, Max, Jess and Ethan, came over to hang out. We had this tradition of spending weekends at my place, eating junk food and binge-watching horror movies until the early hours of the morning. It started as something innocent, just a way to pass the time, but on that particular night, things took a darker turn. Max had brought over an old Ouija board. He'd picked it up from a thrift store a few weeks back, but we never really got around to using it. To be honest, I've always had a weird feeling about that stuff. I'm not a superstitious person, but something about contacting the unknown just didn't sit right with me. Jess was the same way, but Ethan, well, he thought the whole thing was hilarious. He'd make jokes about it like, what's the worst that could happen? A ghost pops out and asks for some pizza. But that night, Max was adamant. Come on, it'll be fun, just for laughs, I promise, he said, waving the board in front of us like it was no big deal. Ethan was all in from the start, egging me and Jess on. What, you guys scared? It's just a piece of wood with some letters on it. So, we set it up. We turned off most of the lights, lit a few candles, and sat around the board, our fingers lightly touching the planchette. It was just for fun, right? Nothing was supposed to happen. At first, it didn't. We asked the usual questions you'd expect. Is anyone here? Can you give us a sign? The planchette didn't move, not even a twitch. I was actually starting to feel relieved, thinking we'd just laugh it off, make some dumb joke, and go back to watching movies. But then, as Ethan was about to crack another joke, the planchette jerked slightly. We all stared at each other in that kind of awkward way when no one wants to admit they might be scared. Max raised an eyebrow. All right, who's messing with it? I'm not, Jess whispered. Her voice sounded strained, like she didn't even believe what she was saying. Ethan, for once, looked genuinely uncomfortable, his grin fading. And as for me, I felt this heavy, uncomfortable pressure in the room, like the air had gotten thicker, colder even. We asked again, is someone here with us? The planchette moved, this time with more force. It slowly slid to yes. Ethan tried to laugh it off. All right, very funny, Max. I know you're pushing it. Max, however, looked dead serious. I swear I'm not. We all removed our hands for a second. The planchette sat still, almost taunting us with its silence. Max then suggested something I wish we hadn't agreed to. Let's ask it what it wants. I wasn't comfortable with that. I didn't want to invite anything else into the conversation, but it was too late. Max had already asked. The planchette began to move again, faster this time, and spelled out a single word. Stay. That's when things started to feel wrong. The candles flickered, the room felt colder than before, and Jess stood up abruptly. This isn't funny anymore. We should stop. But Max was fixated. We have to close the circle first, he said, his voice oddly calm. I didn't know much about Ouija boards, but I had read somewhere that you're supposed to close the circle when you're done. It seemed like a reasonable thing to do, so we all sat back down, eager to end the session. Max tried to say goodbye, moving the planchette to goodbye, but it wouldn't budge. The planchette dragged back to stay. I felt this deep unease settle into my gut. Jess was visibly shaken, and Ethan, who had been joking all night, looked genuinely afraid. I tried to pull my hand away, but it felt like something was holding it in place. We need to stop this, I said, panic rising in my chest. Max's face was pale as he tried to force the planchette to goodbye once more, but no matter how much we tried, it wouldn't move away from stay. The pressure in the room intensified, like something was squeezing the life out of the air itself. Jess suddenly gasped, pointing towards the corner of the room. "Did you see that?" I turned, and for a split second I could have sworn I saw a shadow, tall and thin, lingering near the wall. But when I blinked, it was gone. "We need to close the circle," Max said again, but his voice shook this time. We all tried, all of us desperately moving the planchette towards goodbye, but whatever was in the room with us wasn't going to let us finish. It was like the board had a mind of its own, refusing to let go. That's when the lights flickered and the candles blew out all at once. We sat in pitch-black darkness for a moment, frozen in fear. Then, from somewhere in the house, we heard it. A faint tapping sound, like something was moving inside the walls. "We shouldn't have done this," Jess whispered, barely audible over the pounding in my chest. And that's when I knew, whatever we had let in, it wasn't planning on leaving anytime soon. Something had stayed, and it was just getting started. For the rest of the night, none of us spoke. We just sat there, huddled together in the dim light of the phone flashlights, listening to the faint tapping echo through the house. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, like a soft but deliberate knock, coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I could tell Jess was on the verge of tears. She kept glancing towards the corners of the room, her breath shallow and rapid. Ethan's usual cocky demeanour had completely evaporated. He was pale, eyes wide, gripping his phone like it was some kind of lifeline. Max, though, looked the worst. He hadn't said a word since we'd tried to close the circle. His face was blank, distant, almost like he wasn't there with us anymore. I wanted to leave. Every fibre in my body was screaming at me to get out of the house, but something kept me frozen in place, as if stepping outside would only make things worse. There was this gnawing sensation, like whatever was in the room wasn't just with us. It was watching us, waiting for something. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. "We need to leave," I said, my voice sounding hollow in the silence. Jess nodded quickly, already grabbing her jacket, but Max didn't move. He was still staring at the Ouija board, his fingers twitching slightly like he wanted to reach for the planchette again. "Max," I said firmly, stepping in front of him, "we're leaving." For a moment, he didn't react. Then, slowly, he blinked and looked up at me like he was seeing me for the first time. I can't," he muttered, almost too quiet to hear. "What do you mean you can't?" Ethan asked, his voice strained with fear and frustration. "We just walk out the door, man. This isn't funny anymore." Max shook his head, finally standing up. "No, you don't get it. It wants me to stay." "What wants you to stay?" Jess whispered, her voice trembling. Max didn't answer. He just pointed to the board. I glanced at the board, still lying there on the floor with the planchette dead center on stay. The sight of it made my stomach churn. I grabbed Max by the arm and pulled him towards the door. "Come on, we're getting out of here." We practically ran out of the house, the cold night air hitting us like a slap in the face. For a moment, standing on the front porch, it felt like we were safe, but that was just an illusion. Jess was the first to notice something was wrong. "Did you leave the porch light on?" she asked, looking up at the house. I hadn't, but there it was, glowing dimly from inside the house. The thing is, we turned off all the lights before starting the session. The only illumination had come from the candles, and they'd been blown out. "I thought you said all the lights were off," Ethan muttered, taking a cautious step back. "They were," I replied, my voice shaky. I fumbled for my keys, trying to lock the front door, but the lock wouldn't turn. It was like the door itself was resisting, refusing to shut us out or whatever was inside in. "We need to leave," Jess said again, her voice more desperate this time. But Max stood frozen on the porch, staring at the glowing light through the window. "It doesn't want us to go." "What the hell are you talking about?" Ethan snapped, grabbing Max by the shoulders and shaking him. "Stop acting like this. It's over, okay? We're leaving, and we're not coming back." Max didn't flinch. His eyes were locked on the window, his face pale and expressionless. We didn't close the circle. Those words hung in the air like a death sentence. I could feel the weight of them pressing down on me. He was right. We hadn't closed the circle. We'd left it open, and whatever had come through was still here. "We can't go back in there," Jess whispered, almost like she was talking to herself. "We can't." I was about to agree with her when the tapping started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to get our attention. It wasn't coming from inside the house anymore. It was coming from underneath the porch, from right beneath our feet. Ethan stepped back, nearly tripping over the steps. "What the hell was that?" Before anyone could answer, the porch light flickered and went out. We were plunged into darkness, the only sound being that relentless tapping, growing louder and faster. And then, without warning, the front door creaked open behind us. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like someone, or something, was inviting us back inside. None of us moved. We stood there, staring at the open door, hearts pounding in our chests. The cold air around us felt heavier, almost suffocating, as if whatever was in the house was now reaching out for us. Max took a step forward. "We have to go back." "No," I said quickly, grabbing his arm. "We're not going back in there. Whatever's inside, it's not right. We need to leave, now." But Max wasn't listening. He shook me off, his eyes glazed over like he was in some kind of trance. "If we don't close the circle, it'll never leave." Before I could stop him, Max stepped over the threshold, disappearing into the darkened house. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. We all screamed, Jess, Ethan, and I. But the door didn't open again. The tapping stopped, and all that was left was the sound of our breathing, ragged and terrified. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, paralyzed by fear. Jess was sobbing softly, her hands clutched to her chest, while Ethan stared at the door, his face pale as a ghost. I tried to push the door open, but it wouldn't budge. It was like the house itself had sealed us out, trapping Max inside with whatever we had let in. "We can't just leave him," I whispered, my voice trembling. But deep down, I knew that whatever was inside that house, it wasn't Max anymore. We stood on the porch, paralyzed. Max was inside, and for all we knew, he was trapped with whatever thing we had summoned. The silence that followed was thick, unsettling. Even the night felt unnatural, like the world around us was holding its breath. I wanted to run, to get away from that house as fast as I could. But something in me wouldn't leave Max. As much as I feared what might happen if we stayed, abandoning him wasn't an option. Ethan paced in a small circle, his hands trembling as he pulled out his phone, desperate for some sort of lifeline. "I'll call the cops. They can break the door down or something. They can get Max out of there." "Do you really think the cops can help with this?" Jess said, her voice barely a whisper. She was hugging herself tightly, tears streaming down her face, her eyes red from crying. "We brought something in. You saw it. You felt it. This is not something they can fix." I hated how right she was. I couldn't even picture how that phone call would go. "Hi, officer. We summoned something with a Ouija board, and now our friend is locked inside a house with a ghost." We'd sound insane. But before I could say anything, something thudded against the window next to the door. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make us all jump. Ethan dropped his phone, the screen illuminating the ground for a second before plunging us back into semi-darkness. Jess let out a quiet sob, and I swallowed hard, forcing myself to take a step toward the window. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me not to look. But I had to. I needed to see if it was Max. I approached the window cautiously, holding my breath. The curtains were drawn, but there was just enough space between them to peer inside. I leaned closer, squinting, trying to make out anything in the dim interior. At first, I saw nothing, just the outline of the furniture, the flicker of light from a single candle we hadn't lit. Then, Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Movement. A shadow shifting along the wall. Not walking, but sliding. Almost like it was crawling. I stumbled back from the window, nearly tripping over my own feet. "There's something in there," I gasped. "It's not Max. Something's in there." Ethan looked at me like I'd just confirmed his worst fear. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing fit. The Ouija board, the shadow, the thing that refused to leave. It was all too much. But Max was still inside, and we couldn't just leave him. "We have to try to get him out," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We'll go around to the back. Maybe there's a window or something we can break." Ethan nodded, too terrified to argue. Jess, though, was shaking her head. "I'm not going back in there. I'm not. Whatever's in there isn't going to let us leave. It already has Max. It's not going to stop." Her words chilled me. Deep down, I knew she might be right, but I couldn't abandon Max. We made our way around the house, the night feeling colder with every step. I could hear Ethan's breathing, fast and uneven, and Jess's soft sniffles behind us. The tapping sound had returned, but it wasn't from under the porch anymore. It was following us, moving with us as we circled the house, like it was inside the walls themselves. When we reached the back door, I tried the handle. Locked. No surprise there. But there was a window, and if I could get it open, we might be able to slip inside and find Max, before whatever was in there found us. I grabbed a rock from the garden and smashed it against the window. The glass shattered easily, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet night. I felt a pang of guilt for breaking my own window, but there were bigger problems at hand. "Go! Go!" Ethan urged, his voice shaky. I brushed the shards away and climbed through, carefully lowering myself inside. Ethan followed, then Jess, though she hesitated at the edge, her eyes darting around like she expected something to jump out at her any second. Inside, the air felt different. Stale, heavy, like we were breathing in something that wasn't meant for us. The house was silent, the only sound our footsteps on the floor, which seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet. "Max!" I called out, keeping my voice low, almost like I was afraid to disturb whatever was lurking in the dark. There was no response. The tapping had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I felt it, in every corner of the room, in the walls, in the floor. Like eyes that weren't quite human. My skin prickled, and I fought the urge to run back out the broken window. Ethan motioned toward the living room, where we had left the Ouija board. As we walked into the room, my heart sank. The board was still there, but the planchette was no longer on stay. It had moved. Slowly, almost mockingly, it had spelled out, "Welcome." Jess stifled a scream, her hand flying to her mouth. "We shouldn't be here. We need to get out." But just as she said that, there was a creak from the hallway, followed by soft footsteps. Ethan grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. "It's coming," he whispered. The footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate, like someone, or something, was taking its time, savoring every step. The darkness at the end of the hallway seemed to shift, a shadow moving toward us. I backed away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Max. But it wasn't Max. The shape was wrong. Too tall, too thin. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, like it wasn't used to walking. And then, as it stepped into the faint light, we saw it. It wasn't Max. Whatever was in the house with us, it had no face, no eyes, no mouth, no features at all. Just a blank black void where a face should have been. Its head tilted slightly, as if it were looking at us, even though there were no eyes to see with. We were frozen, too terrified to move, too terrified to scream. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at us with that empty, featureless face. And then it moved again, slowly raising its hand. That's when the lights went out. When the lights went out, the darkness wasn't just black. It was suffocating. a thick, oppressive void that felt like it was closing in on us from all sides. The kind of dark where you can't see your own hand in front of your face, where every breath feels like you're pulling in more than just air. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest, I was sure it would give me away, alerting whatever was out there in the hallway. I heard Ethan's ragged breathing somewhere to my left, Jess stifling sobs to my right. None of us dared to move. That thing, we all saw it, standing there with its featureless face and unnaturally stiff movements, was still in the house with us. And worse, it wasn't Max. Whatever we'd let in had taken his place. For a second, everything was dead silent. No footsteps, no tapping, just the shallow, panicked breaths we tried so hard to control. Then, out of nowhere, the floorboards creaked, right behind me. I felt a rush of cold air on the back of my neck, as if something was inches away, leaning over me. Every muscle in my body locked up in fear, and all I could think was, "Don't turn around, don't look." But then Ethan whispered, "It's right behind us." That was all it took. Instinct kicked in, and I ran. I couldn't help it. Every rational thought vanished the moment I felt that icy presence, and I bolted blindly into the dark. My shoulder slammed into something, maybe the wall or the corner of a door frame, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. My mind was racing with one singular thought: get out. Behind me, I heard Jess scream, followed by the sound of her footsteps pounding against the floor as she ran. Ethan was right behind her, cursing under his breath. We stumbled into the kitchen, the only place I could think of that had any kind of exit. The window. The one we had broken earlier. But as I fumbled my way toward it, my hand brushing the jagged glass shards still hanging in the frame, I heard a soft click. The door leading to the back of the house slowly creaked open. Something was coming. It wasn't running. It wasn't rushing toward us. It was just walking, calm, patient, like it had all the time in the world. And that's when I realized it wasn't just one thing. There were two. I felt Ethan bump into me as he staggered into the kitchen, his hands searching for something to use, some kind of weapon. His fingers wrapped around a kitchen knife, and he held it out, his hand trembling. "If it comes in here," he started, but didn't finish. Jess was breathing heavily, her back pressed against the fridge, tears streaming down her face. "We're trapped," she whispered. "We're trapped." I didn't want to believe her. There had to be a way out. There had to be something we could do to fix this. And then, the memory hit me. Max's voice in my head saying, "We didn't close the circle." It was still open. Whatever we let through the board was feeding off that. It didn't need to rush us because it knew we were already trapped. "We have to finish it," I blurted out, my voice shaky. "We have to close the circle." Ethan shot me a confused, panicked look. "What the hell are you talking about?" "The board. We didn't close the session. That's why it's still here." Jess let out a small, desperate laugh, her voice laced with hysteria. "You really think closing the circle is going to stop that?" She gestured wildly toward the dark doorway where those things were slowly approaching. I didn't know if it would work, but it was the only thing that made sense in this nightmare. We don't have a choice. The tapping had returned, louder now, coming from every corner of the house. It wasn't following us anymore. It was surrounding us. I took a deep breath and moved toward the hallway. Ethan grabbed my arm. "You're not serious. You can't go back there." But what choice did we have? We couldn't fight it. We couldn't outrun it. The only chance we had was to finish what we started. "We don't have time, Ethan. Either we close that circle, or we're not making it out of this house." Jess shook her head frantically, but she didn't stop me. None of them did. I stepped out of the kitchen, my legs shaking so badly I thought they might give out beneath me. Every step felt like a countdown towards something I didn't want to face. The hallway stretched out ahead of me, impossibly long, like it had grown somehow since we first entered the house. The air felt even heavier, almost like I was walking through water, thick and suffocating. And then I saw it. The thing. It stood at the end of the hallway, its blank face staring directly at me. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze. Cold, empty, wrong. My breath caught in my throat, but I forced myself forward. One step, then another. My eyes stayed locked on the thing, but I refused to slow down. Behind me, I heard Jess and Ethan following, their footsteps soft, cautious. None of us spoke. We didn't need to. The weight of what we were doing was hanging in the air, crushing us with every second that passed. As I entered the living room, the board was still there, illuminated by that single flickering candle. The planchette had moved again, but this time, it spelled out something else. Stay with us. A chill ran down my spine, but I didn't stop. I dropped to my knees in front of the board, Jess and Ethan hovering behind me. Okay, I whispered, barely able to find my voice. We have to say goodbye, together. Ethan knelt beside me, his hand trembling as he placed his fingers on the planchette. Jess hesitated, but eventually did the same. Goodbye, I said softly. The planchette didn't move. Goodbye, Ethan repeated, his voice shaky. Still nothing. I glanced at Jess, her face pale and terror-stricken. Jess, I urged. She swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. Goodbye. For a moment, nothing happened. I thought maybe it was too late. Maybe we had waited too long, and now we were stuck here, trapped with whatever we had let in. But then, slowly, the planchette began to move. It slid across the board, the wood scraping against the surface as it made its way toward goodbye. The moment it reached the word, the air shifted. The tapping stopped. The weight lifted. And for the first time since we started, I felt like I could breathe again. But just as I let out a sigh of relief, I heard it. A voice, low and distorted, coming from the hallway. Too late. The lights flickered back on. Max was standing at the end of the hallway, staring at us with wide, vacant eyes. But it wasn't Max. I could see it in the way his body moved, the way his head tilted unnaturally to the side, a twisted grin stretching across his face. It wasn't Max at all. Max stood there, motionless, his body silhouetted against the flickering light in the hallway. That grin, too wide, too forced, spread across his face like it had been carved there. His eyes, once full of life and personality, were empty, hollow, as if something else was looking out from behind them. For a moment, none of us moved. We just stared, paralyzed by the sight of him, if you could even call it him anymore. My mind was screaming at me that something was deeply, horribly wrong, but I couldn't process it. I couldn't accept that the person standing in front of us was no longer the friend we knew. Ethan was the first to break the silence. "Max," he whispered, his voice trembling, barely audible. But the thing that looked like Max didn't respond. It just started walking toward us, slowly, with that same jerky, unnatural gait. The sound of its footsteps on the hardwood floor was unnervingly rhythmic, like each step had been measured, calculated. "We closed the circle," Jess muttered, panic lacing every word. "We closed it. This shouldn't be happening." But it was happening. The planchette had said, goodbye. The air had lightened, but the thing in Max's body hadn't left. It was still here, and it was coming for us. "Get back," I said, my voice barely steady as I pulled Jess and Ethan behind me. My legs were trembling so much I could hardly stand, but I had to do something, anything to stop whatever was coming toward us. Max, if I could even call him that, stopped at the edge of the living room. His head tilted to the side again, that grin still plastered on his face. And then, in a voice that wasn't his own, he said, "You didn't finish." The words sent a chill down my spine. They were distorted, almost robotic, like they were being forced through broken speakers. I didn't understand what he meant. We'd closed the circle. We'd done everything right. "Finish what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His grin widened, impossibly, grotesquely. as if the skin on his face was being pulled too tight. And then he pointed to the Ouija board. The planchette was moving again, slowly sliding across the board, spelling out a new word. S-T-A-Y. No, Jess whispered, her voice cracking. We said goodbye. We did everything we were supposed to. But the board didn't care. It had made its choice. I looked back at Max, his vacant eyes boring into mine, and something in my gut twisted. This wasn't just about closing the circle. Whatever we had brought through wasn't bound by the rules we thought we understood. It had its own set of rules, and we had broken them. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows on the walls twisting unnaturally as the lights flickered again. I could feel it now, something much bigger than us, something ancient, something that had been waiting for a long time. And we had let it in. Ethan grabbed my arm, his grip tight. We need to get out of here, now. But the moment he said that, Max, or whatever was wearing Max's body, took another step forward, blocking the exit. His movements were slow, deliberate, but filled with a kind of malice that made my skin crawl. I backed away, pulling Jess and Ethan with me, but we were running out of room. The house suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were closing in, trapping us. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. We didn't finish, I muttered, trying to piece together what he meant. What does that mean? Max's head tilted again, and he let out a low, distorted laugh that didn't sound human. You invited us, he said, but you didn't close the door. My heart sank. The session. We had never officially closed the door. We hadn't just left the circle open, we'd left the house open. We didn't stop it from coming through, Jess whispered, the realization hitting her just as hard. It's here because we never finished the session. Max, no, the thing, smiled wider, its eyes gleaming with something dark, something hungry. We're not leaving. And then, before any of us could react, the lights in the house exploded, plunging us into total darkness. The air was filled with the sound of shattering glass, and Jess screamed. I grabbed her hand, pulling her close as we huddled together, our breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. From the hallway, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, like something was walking through the broken glass, taking its time. I could hear Jess sobbing softly beside me, her grip tightening on my arm. Ethan was muttering under his breath, something about how we needed to leave, but there was no way out. We were trapped. The footsteps grew closer, and I could feel the cold seeping into the room, wrapping around us like a shroud. My heart was pounding so loudly in my ears, I couldn't hear anything else. All I could think was that this was it. This was how it ended. Whatever we had brought through, it wasn't going to leave, and neither were we. But then, from somewhere deep in the house, I heard a voice. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but unmistakable. Help me. I froze. It was Max's voice, his real voice. Max! I called out, my voice shaking. There was no response, but the footsteps stopped. The thing in the hallway hesitated, and for the briefest moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Max was still in there. Maybe he was fighting whatever had taken him. Maybe we still had a chance. I didn't know what to do, but I knew we couldn't stay there. We had to get Max back, or at least try. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. We need to force it out, I said, though I had no idea how. We have to make it leave. Jess looked at me like I was crazy, and maybe I was, but what other choice did we have? We couldn't run, we couldn't hide. The only thing we could do was fight. Max, I called out again, louder this time. If you're still in there, you need to fight it. You need to come back. There was a long, terrifying silence. And then, the voice came again, weaker this time. Help me. It was Max. I took a step toward the hallway, my heart racing. We're coming, Max. Just hold on. The thing in the hallway shifted, its movements erratic, almost like it was struggling to maintain control. For the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in in its empty eyes. It didn't want to lose him. "Go," I urged Jess and Ethan. "We need to close the door. For real this time." They hesitated but followed as I made my way back to the Ouija board. The planchette was still resting on stay, but I wasn't going to let it win. Together, we placed our hands on the planchette and moved it slowly, deliberately, toward goodbye. The house seemed to groan around us, the air growing thicker as we pushed the planchette across the board. "Goodbye," I whispered. The second it reached the end, the house erupted in a deafening roar, like the very walls were screaming in agony. The air turned frigid, and for a moment, I thought we were too late. But then, just as quickly as it started, the noise stopped. The air was still. The cold was gone. I turned toward the hallway. Max was standing there, his face pale but his eyes clear. He looked like he'd just woken up from a nightmare, his body trembling. "Max?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He blinked, his expression confused, but then he nodded. It's gone." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think that whatever we had let in was finally gone. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not yet. Halloween night has always had a weird kind of energy, hasn't it? Maybe it's just the vibe of the holiday, the costumes, the decorations, the way people let their guard down and get a little more reckless. That's probably what got us in trouble in the first place. I mean, we didn't think anything would actually happen. It was just supposed to be a fun night, you know. But what went down that Halloween is something none of us could have expected. It was me, Hannah, Nate, and Lex. We've been friends forever, like back to elementary school days, and every year we do something a little more daring for Halloween. This time, Lex suggested we go to the abandoned house on Cedar Road. The place was a legend in our town, supposedly haunted by the ghost of some guy who died there in the 80s. You know the kind of story, local urban myth stuff. But Lex didn't stop there. She brought a Ouija board. Now, I've never been into that kind of thing. Hannah was the same way. She'd always roll her eyes whenever people talked about ghosts or spirits. But Nate, he was all about it. He loved that creepy stuff, and he was all over the idea of using the board in the abandoned house. And Lex, well, she was just fearless. Always the one pushing us to do crazier things. We didn't start the night intending to mess with the supernatural. We were supposed to hit a few parties, grab some candy like we were still kids, and maybe prank some of the younger trick-or-treaters. But when we ended up at that house with the board, the night took a different turn. We got to the house around 10 p.m, and it was already cold enough that our breath hung in the air. The place looked worse than I remembered. Windows boarded up, the paint peeling off the walls, the yard overgrown with weeds. Lex was excited though. She didn't even hesitate, just kicked open the loose door and marched inside, like it was no big deal. Nate followed right behind her, of course, with a grin on his face like this was going to be the highlight of the year. Hannah and I exchanged a look, both of us clearly uncomfortable. But we went in anyway. Peer pressure's a hell of a thing. The inside of the house was even worse. It smelled like damp wood and something rotten, though none of us could find the source. The floor creaked with every step, and the only light came from the street outside, filtering in through the gaps in the boarded windows. "This is the perfect spot," Lex said, laying the Ouija board down on the floor in what used to be the living room. "Let's do this." Nate was already pulling out his phone to record it, like he was expecting something Instagram-worthy. Hannah crossed her arms, clearly not thrilled, but she sat down next to the board anyway. I was the last to join them, my stomach doing flips. I wasn't scared. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. But there was something off about the house, like it didn't want us there. We all placed our fingers on the planchette, and Lex wasted no time jumping into it. "Is there anyone here with us?" she asked, her voice light, almost mocking. At first, nothing happened. The planchette stayed completely still, just like I expected. I was about to say something, make a joke about how dumb this was, but then it moved, just a little, a tiny jerk to the left. I shot a glance at Nate, assuming he was messing with us, but he looked just as surprised as I felt. Lex grinned. Okay, we're getting somewhere. Are you a spirit? The planchette didn't move at first, but then it slowly slid toward yes. My heart started beating faster, and I could tell from the way Hannah stiffened that she was feeling it too. But Lex, she was loving it. What's your name? She asked. The planchette started to move again, slowly spelling out a jumble of letters that didn't make any sense. DOXNA. We all looked at each other, confused. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Nate muttered, his eyes darting around the room like he was expecting something to pop out at any second. But before any of us could figure it out, the planchette jerked violently. This wasn't like the little twitch from earlier. It was like someone yanked it out from under our fingers, sliding it hard across the board. We all jumped back, staring at it as it pointed directly to goodbye. Lex laughed nervously, breaking the tension. Okay, that was weird. Someone's definitely messing with us. Not me, Nate said quickly. Hannah shook her head too, her face pale. I could feel the air in the room changing. It was heavier, colder, the kind of cold that gets deep into your bones. Maybe we should stop, I suggested, standing up. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing straight up, and every instinct in me was screaming that we needed to get out of there. But Lex wasn't done. She grabbed the planchette, forcing it back to the center of the board. Don't be a buzzkill, she said, her voice just a little too tight. We're fine. It's just a game. I was about to argue, but then it happened. The floor creaked, loudly. We all froze, staring at the spot where the sound came from, but there was nothing there. No one had moved. Then another creak, this time from behind us. It was as if the house itself was shifting, like the walls were breathing, expanding and contracting with each step we took. Hannah stood up, her eyes wide. Okay, seriously, let's get out of here. This isn't funny anymore. Lex was about to respond, probably with some smart-ass comment, but then the door to the room slammed shut. No wind, no draft. Just the door, slamming on its own with a force that rattled the walls. I've never seen Lex look scared, but in that moment, she did. We all did. The room went silent, and I swear in that silence, I could feel something there with us. It wasn't like a presence you could see or touch. It was something in the air, a weight pressing down on us, making it hard to breathe. We were no longer alone. We need to leave, I said again, but this time no one argued. We rushed for the door, and that's when I felt it, the first touch. It was subtle, like a brush against my arm, but there was nothing there. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I turned, half expecting to see someone behind me, but the room was empty. And then Nate spoke, his voice shaky. Did anyone else feel that? We all nodded, too freaked out to speak. Whatever we had summoned wasn't something we could see, but we could feel it, and it wasn't going to let us leave without a fight. We didn't stop moving until we were halfway down the street, huddled together under one of those flickering streetlights that always seemed to make everything feel worse. The house loomed behind us, dark and silent, like it was watching. None of us spoke for a good minute, just catching our breath, trying to shake off the feeling that something was still with us, following us, even though we couldn't see it. Hannah was the first to break the silence. What the hell was that? She was shaking, her voice barely steady. Nate was pacing, running his hands through his hair. I don't know, man, but it wasn't just the wind. Doors don't slam like that on their own. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by this nervous energy I'd never seen in him before. Lex, though. She stood there, staring back at the house like she was trying to make sense of it all. Her fearless attitude had faded, and I could see the doubt creeping in. Maybe the house is just old, she muttered, almost like she was trying to convince herself more than us. You know, creaky floors, loose doors, stuff like that. But even she didn't sound sure anymore. We all felt it. That cold, invisible touch, like fingers brushing against your skin when there's no one around. It wasn't the kind of fear you could just laugh off. It stuck to us, clinging like a shadow. "I felt it," I finally said. "In the house. Something touched me." Lex turned, her expression hard to read. "Are you sure?" Hannah nodded, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, like she was trying to hold herself together. "I felt it too, right before the door slammed." Nate stopped pacing, his eyes darting between us. "Okay, so what now? We can't just leave it like this." "Like what?" I asked, already knowing the answer but dreading it. He ran his hands through his hair again. "The board, the session, we didn't finish it." I hadn't even thought about that. We'd just bolted, leaving the Ouija board behind. Everything I'd heard about Ouija boards, all the warnings about making sure you close the session properly. We'd broken every single rule. No goodbye, no closure. We had invited something, and we didn't send it back. "You've got to be kidding me," Hannah whispered, shaking her head. "There's no way I'm going back in there." Number Way Lex, ever the stubborn one, was already straightening up, that look of determination creeping back into her eyes. "We can't just leave it like that. If we don't close it, who knows what we let out?" I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew she was right. Something had come through, something we couldn't see, but it was still here. The thought of leaving it unchecked, free to do whatever it wanted, made my skin crawl. "Fine," I muttered, swallowing the lump of fear in my throat. "But we're in and out, no more messing around." Lex nodded, already walking back toward the house. Nate followed, though I could tell he wasn't thrilled about it. Hannah stood frozen for a second, looking like she might refuse, but eventually she sighed and hurried after us. The walk back to the house felt longer, like the street itself had stretched out, as if it didn't want us to come back. The further we walked, the colder it got, even though the air had been perfectly fine just a few minutes ago. When we reached the front door, it was still slightly ajar, just like we'd left it. But standing there, staring into the blackness of the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't just a creepy old house anymore. It felt aware, like it was waiting for us. Lex pushed the door open wider, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. The smell of damp wood and rot hit us again, stronger this time. I hesitated at the threshold, a chill creeping up my spine, but Lex stepped in without a second thought. Nate followed, then me, then Hannah, though she lingered for a moment, clearly not wanting to be the last one inside. The Ouija board was still there, right where we left it, the planchette lying on the board, unmoved. Everything else in the room was exactly the same, but the air was thicker, heavier, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. Lex knelt down, placing her fingers on the planchette. "Let's just finish this and get out of here," she said, her voice steady but low. Nate and I joined her, our fingers lightly touching the planchette. Hannah, after a long hesitation, crouched down next to me, her fingers shaking as she placed them on the board. "Are you still here?" Lex asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For a long moment, nothing happened. We all held our breath, waiting, hoping maybe whatever had been in the house was gone. Maybe it was just a fluke, just some old house playing tricks on us. But then, slowly, the planchette began to move. It wasn't a jerk or a sudden movement. It was slow, deliberate, like something was guiding it. My heart pounded in my chest as it slid across the board, spelling out one word: Y-E-S. Hannah gasped, pulling her hand away. No, I'm not doing this, I can't." But before anyone could say anything, the room felt different again. The temperature dropped, like the heat had been sucked out of the air. And then came the sound, the faintest, softest whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe the old house settling. But then I realized it was a voice, a low, barely there voice, speaking in a language I didn't understand. Lex's eyes went wide, and I could see her trying to stay calm, but there was fear in her expression. "Did you guys hear that?" I nodded, too scared to speak. We all heard it, but it wasn't coming from any one direction. It was all around us, like the very walls were whispering. Nate stood up quickly, his eyes darting around the room. "I don't like this. We should go. We need to go now." Lex shook her head, though I could see her resolve starting to crack. "We need to close the session first. We need to say goodbye." I wanted to argue, wanted to tell her we should just run and never look back, but something stopped me. The feeling that if we left now, whatever was in the house would follow us. It wasn't trapped here. Not anymore. "Goodbye," Lex said, her voice shaking as she moved the planchette to the word. But the planchette didn't stay there. It jerked violently across the board, sliding back to yes with such force that it almost flew off the table. Yes. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, like it was closing in on us. And then, just like before, I felt it, that cold, invisible touch, brushing against my arm. But this time, it didn't stop. Hannah screamed and I turned just in time to see her stumble back, clutching her arm. "It touched me," she cried, her voice breaking. "It's here. It's right here." And that's when I realized we hadn't just summoned something. We had let it out. And now it wasn't going to leave us alone. Hannah's scream echoed through the room, bouncing off the decaying walls. My heart was racing, my mind spinning as the air around us grew colder and heavier. It wasn't just the cold touch anymore. It was everywhere. You could feel it in the space between us like something thick and alive, watching, waiting. Nate grabbed Hannah, trying to calm her down, but his hands were shaking just as much as hers. "What do we do?" His voice cracked with panic, and I didn't blame him. None of us knew what to do. Lex was still sitting in front of the Ouija board, frozen, staring at the planchette like she couldn't believe what was happening. For the first time, she looked genuinely scared. I don't know why that freaked me out more. Maybe because she was always the fearless one, the one who laughed in the face of danger. But now she looked as terrified as the rest of us. "We have to stop it," I said, though my voice wavered. I had no idea how to stop anything at that point. "We have to close it properly." "It won't let us," Lex snapped, her frustration boiling over. "It won't let us say goodbye. Every time we try, it stops us." That's when the whispering started again, louder this time. Not words, not anything any of us could understand, but it was there, surrounding us. It sounded like voices overlapping, layers of something dark and ancient, pressing against our ears, like they were trying to crawl into our heads. "We need to go." Hannah's voice was desperate. She was already inching toward the door, her eyes darting around the room like she was expecting something to reach out from the shadows. And honestly, I was too. There was a pressure in the air, something I couldn't see but could feel, getting closer, like the walls themselves were pushing in on us. But Lex shook her head. "If we leave now, it'll follow us. We can't just walk out without finishing this." That was the problem. We had no idea how to finish it. Nate backed away from the board, dragging Hannah with him. "This isn't worth it, Lex. You think a dumb board game is going to stop whatever that is?" He pointed around the room as if to say, "Look at what's happening. This isn't normal." And he was right. Every inch of the house felt hostile now. The floorboards creaked even though no one was moving, and the shadows seemed to stretch out, longer than they should be. There was something wrong with the space around us, like reality itself was warping, twisting to let this thing exist in our world. Lex hesitated, her bravado cracking as she glanced around the room. She didn't want to admit it, but she was just as freaked out as the rest of us. "We just need to say goodbye," she whispered again, her fingers trembling as she placed them back on the planchette. "We can end it. We just have to try again." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that closing the board properly would solve everything, but deep down, I knew it wasn't going to be that easy. Still, we didn't have a choice. "All right," I said, stepping forward and placing my fingers on the planchette again, though every part of me wanted to run. "One last try." Nate stayed back with Hannah, neither of them willing to touch the board again. I didn't blame them. It was clear that this thing, whatever it was, wasn't going to leave us alone without a fight. Lex, her voice barely above a whisper, said the words again. "Goodbye." For a moment, nothing happened. The planchette didn't move, and the room was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Then, just as we started to breathe, thinking maybe, just maybe it was over, the board violently jerked, the planchette sliding rapidly across the letters. It spelled out one word: no. The lights, weak as they were, flickered, and the temperature dropped even more. I could see my breath now, each exhale turning into a puff of fog. The thing in the room with us, it wasn't just playing games anymore. It was angry. The whispering grew louder, more aggressive, like it was coming from all sides, circling us. I felt that cold touch again, but this time it wasn't just a brush against my arm. It was gripping me, cold fingers wrapping around my wrist, squeezing tightly enough that it actually hurt. I gasped, jerking my hand away from the board, stumbling back. It touched me. "It's real," I choked out, my voice barely steady. Lex didn't move. She was staring at the board, her eyes wide, her face pale. "It doesn't want us to leave," she whispered. Nate was at the door, pulling on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "It's stuck," he yelled, slamming his shoulder into the wood. "I can't get it open." That's when the lights cut out completely, plunging us into darkness. Hannah screamed again, and I could hear Nate cursing under his breath as he tried to force the door open. Lex scrambled for her phone, flicking on the flashlight, but the weak beam did little to cut through the heavy dark that seemed to wrap around us like a shroud. In the dim light, I saw something move. It was quick, just a flicker in the corner of my vision, but it was enough to send my heart racing. I swung the light toward it, but there was nothing there. Nothing we could see anyway. "It's here," I whispered, the words barely audible, my throat tight with fear. The whispering turned into something worse, more like a growl now, deep and guttural, echoing through the room, vibrating through the floorboards. The cold intensified, wrapping around us like icy fingers, digging into our skin. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the air itself seemed to thicken with something dark, something malicious. And then it happened. Something shoved me, hard, knocking me off balance. I stumbled back, crashing into the wall, my head spinning as pain shot through my shoulder. "It's touching us," I shouted, panic flooding my voice. Hannah was crying now, her back pressed against the door, her eyes wide with terror. Nate was frantically kicking at the door, trying to force it open, but it wasn't budging. And then, as suddenly as it began, the growling stopped. The room fell into dead silence. But the pressure, the cold, the presence, it was still there. I could feel it, watching us, waiting. "We need to say goodbye," Lex whispered, her voice trembling. I stared at the board, my heart pounding in my chest. It's not going to let us. But Lex was already reaching for the planchette again, her fingers trembling as she placed them on the board. I hesitated, then slowly did the same. "Goodbye," she whispered one more time. The planchette didn't move, but we weren't alone anymore. I could feel it standing right behind me. I could feel it behind me, close enough that the hair on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't just a presence anymore. It was real. Every instinct in my body screamed to run, but where? We were trapped, and there was nowhere to go. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. The room had gone deathly quiet, but the silence wasn't a relief. It was a warning. Lex sat there, her fingers still pressed on the planchette, her breathing shallow, I could see the panic in her eyes. She felt it too. It was like we were holding our breath, waiting for something to happen, praying that whatever was with us would just disappear. But nothing about this felt like it was going to end peacefully. Hannah, still sobbing softly, was pressed against the door, staring into the darkness. "It's here," she whispered, her voice trembling, barely holding it together. "It's right there." Nate, in the dim light from his phone, was standing completely still, his eyes wide as he aimed the flashlight at the center of the room. The beam flickered, casting strange shadows on the peeling wallpaper, but nothing stood out. Yet we all knew it was there. We didn't need to see it. Lex swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper as she tried again. "Goodbye," she said, forcing the word out like it would be enough to make the nightmare stop. The planchette didn't move. I could feel it under my fingers, heavy, like it was stuck to the board. No matter how much Lex or I tried to move it, it wouldn't budge. The house, no, the thing, wasn't letting us end this. Then, just as the silence was becoming unbearable, the whispering returned. Louder this time, harsher. It wasn't just whispers anymore. It was a chorus of voices, overlapping, angry. They filled the room, bouncing off the walls, swirling around us like a storm. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable. They didn't want us here. The temperature dropped even further, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, making it hard to think, hard to move. My breath fogged the air, and I could hear Nate muttering under his breath, like he was trying to convince himself this wasn't real. Then, without warning, the planchette moved. Not gently this time. It jerked violently across the board, spelling out one word: stay. We all froze. Lex's hand flew off the planchette, her eyes wide in disbelief. What does that mean?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. But I already knew. It didn't want us to leave. It didn't want us to say goodbye. It wanted us to stay. "I don't care what it wants," Nate said suddenly, his voice shaky but firm. "We need to get out of here. Now!" He rushed toward the door, grabbing the handle again and yanking as hard as he could. But the door wouldn't budge. It was like something on the other side was holding it shut, refusing to let us out. Hannah was sobbing openly now, her hands pressed to her face. "We're trapped," she cried, her voice muffled. "It's not going to let us leave." Lex stood up, backing away from the board, her face pale. "This isn't right," she said, shaking her head. "None of this is right. I didn't think..." "Didn't think what?" Nate snapped, his voice rising in panic. "That we'd actually summoned something. You brought the board, Lex. You thought this was all just some game." The anger in his voice cut through the fear. But before Lex could respond, there was a loud thud from upstairs. We all froze, our eyes darting to the ceiling. The sound was unmistakable. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving across the floor above us. My blood ran cold. "There's someone else here," Hannah whimpered. "Number not someone." The footsteps continued, growing louder, heading toward the staircase. We could hear the old wood creaking under the weight of something heavy, something we couldn't see but knew was there. Lex backed up further, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. None of us did. We stood there, frozen, listening as the footsteps descended the stairs, one slow step at a time. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of each creak sending a fresh wave of panic through my body. And then the whispering stopped. For a moment, everything went still again, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. We stood there, waiting, bracing ourselves for whatever was coming next. The air was thick with tension, so heavy it was hard to breathe. Then, from the shadows near the base of the stairs, something moved. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of darkness shifting unnaturally. But it was enough to send my heart racing. "Do you see that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Nate aimed the flashlight toward the stairs, but the beam flickered, struggling to cut through the thick shadows. "There's something there," he muttered, his voice barely steady. "But I can't see it." Lex grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "We have to finish this," she whispered urgently. "We have to say goodbye." I wanted to. I wanted to believe that saying goodbye would make this all go away, but every instinct told me that it wasn't that simple anymore. We had opened the door, and now something was here. Something that wasn't going to leave just because we asked it to. Then, as if responding to my thoughts, the planchette on the board moved again. This time, it spelled out another word. R-U-N. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't a warning, it was a command. Whatever was in this house, it didn't want to play anymore. It wanted us gone. And if we didn't leave, I had a feeling we wouldn't get another chance. Nate's flashlight flickered again, and this time it went out completely, plunging us into darkness. Hannah screamed, and I grabbed for my phone, fumbling to turn on the light. But before I could, I felt it. Something cold, something heavy brushing against my shoulder. It wasn't a touch, it was a grip. I gasped, stumbling back, barely managing to keep my balance. "We need to get out of here, now!" "How?" Lex cried. "The door won't open." I didn't have an answer, but we couldn't just stand there. Not with that thing in the room with us. Then, as if in response to my thoughts, there was another loud crash, this time from the direction of the front door. A gust of cold air rushed in, and I realized in a moment of pure panic that the door had finally been blown open. "We have to go," I yelled, grabbing Lex and pulling her toward the door. Nate and Hannah were already running, pushing their way out into the cold night. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what was behind us. But as we ran down the street, the house looming behind us, I could feel it. We weren't alone. The cold night air hit us like a slap, but the feeling of relief didn't come. Even though we were outside the house, I knew deep down that whatever was in there wasn't staying in there. As we ran down the street, stumbling over ourselves in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind us, just out of sight, watching, waiting. Nate was ahead of us, breathing heavily, his flashlight bobbing as he sprinted down the road. Hannah clung to his arm, still sobbing, barely able to keep up. Lex was next to me, her hand gripping my wrist so tightly it hurt, but I didn't tell her to stop. I needed that contact, something to ground me in the reality of the situation because everything felt unreal. We reached the edge of the neighborhood and finally stopped, gasping for air. Nate doubled over, hands on his knees trying to catch his breath. "What the hell just happened?" he wheezed. I didn't answer. I didn't have one. Hannah collapsed on the curb, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. "It's not over," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not over." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that we'd escaped, that whatever was in that house was stuck there. But the truth was, I felt it too. The cold, the weight, the presence. It had followed us. Lex stood up, her face pale, her eyes staring down the empty street. "We need to finish it. We need to go back." "No," I said firmly, shaking my head. "We're not going back in there. We barely made it out alive." She turned to me, desperation in her eyes. "Don't you get it? It's not about the house. It's about what we let in. If we don't finish this, it'll follow us wherever we go." Nate straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Lex is right. We didn't finish the session. We didn't close it. We just ran, and now it's out here with us." As if on cue, the streetlight above us flickered, casting eerie shadows over the empty road. The air around us grew colder again, that same suffocating cold that made it hard to think, hard to breathe. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising panic. So, what do we do? How do we finish it? Lex was already pulling her phone out, scrolling through frantic searches on the internet. There has to be something. Some way to close the connection. We didn't follow the rules. I wanted to scream, to tell her this wasn't some stupid game you could fix with a Google search, but deep down, I knew she was right. We had broken something, opened a door we had no business touching, and now it was wide open. If we didn't do something, it wasn't just going to let us walk away. I found something, Lex said, her voice low, almost shaky. It says we can finish the session by saying goodbye, but we need to do it somewhere safe, somewhere that's not connected to the spirit. Nate frowned. So, not back at the house? Lex nodded. Exactly. If we go back there, we're giving it more power. We need to find neutral ground, someplace where it can't hurt us. I looked around the empty street, the shadows stretching longer and darker than they should have. Every instinct told me to run, to get as far away from this town as possible, but it wouldn't help. We couldn't run from something like this. It would just follow. There's an old park nearby, I said, my voice barely steady. It's quiet, abandoned. No one goes there. Lex nodded, already grabbing her things. That'll work. We just need to get this done. We made our way toward the park, our footsteps echoing in the empty night. The cold seemed to cling to us, the air growing denser with every step. The shadows moved unnaturally, flickering at the edges of my vision like they were alive. By the time we reached the park, the tension was unbearable. The wind had picked up, rustling through the trees, but it didn't feel like wind. It felt like something was moving just out of sight, brushing past us in the dark. We found a spot near an old, rusted playground, the swings creaking softly in the breeze. Lex knelt down, placing the Ouija board on the ground in front of us. Nate and I joined her, our hands trembling as we touched the planchette. Hannah stood back, too afraid to participate, but unwilling to leave. Okay, Lex whispered. Let's finish this. We all placed our fingers on the planchette, and Lex spoke the words softly, as if afraid to anger whatever was out there. We're sorry. We didn't mean to summon you. We're closing the session now. Goodbye. For a moment, nothing happened. The wind stilled, the air heavy and cold. And then, slowly, the planchette began to move. It wasn't fast or violent this time. It moved with a deliberate, almost reluctant slowness, sliding toward goodbye. My heart pounded in my chest as we watched it, praying that this was enough, that we were doing the right thing. Finally, the planchette reached the word goodbye. The air around us shifted, like something had been lifted, but the cold didn't go away. It lingered, just out of reach, waiting. We did it, Lex whispered, her voice shaky. We finished it. But as she stood up, I felt it again, that cold, invisible grip. This time it was on my shoulder, squeezing hard enough to make me flinch. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just darkness. Nate looked at me, his eyes wide. Did you feel that? I nodded, my throat tight. It's still here. We all stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. The planchette had moved to goodbye. We had done everything right, but something wasn't letting go. Then, from behind us, came a soft creaking sound. The swings. They were moving slowly at first, then faster, as if someone invisible was sitting on them, pushing them back and forth. The air around us grew thick again, and that whispering, that horrible, guttural whispering, returned. Lex took a step back, her face pale. Number, this can't be happening. But it was. Whatever we had summoned, whatever had followed us, it wasn't going to leave. And we weren't going to be able to run. The cold wrapped around me like a vice, and I knew then, deep in my bones, that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. It started like most dumb decisions do, out of boredom. It was just me, my roommates, and a Ouija board we picked up for cheap at a local thrift store. Our house was an old 2-story place we'd rented just outside of town. Nothing special, really. The kind of place with creaky floors and the smell of old wood seeping into every corner. But we were in college and rent was cheap, so we didn't care. It was a typical Friday night, the kind where you've got nothing going on and nothing better to do. Ben, my roommate, was the one who suggested we mess with the Ouija board. He always had a fascination with creepy stuff. You know the type. He's the guy who wants to watch the scariest horror movies at 3 a.m. for fun. Jessie, on the other hand, was more skeptical. She rolled her eyes when Ben pulled out the board, but there was no way she was going to be the only one not playing. I didn't really believe in that stuff either. Ghosts, spirits, Ouija boards. It all seemed like harmless superstition. But I also wasn't about to back out, so we set it up in the living room. The floor lamp flickered slightly as we all sat in a circle around the board, each of us placing our fingertips lightly on the planchette. Ben grinned like he was enjoying this way too much. "All right, let's see what the spirits have to say," he said, his voice dripping with dramatic flair. Jessie rolled her eyes but muttered under her breath, "This is so stupid." I just shrugged and went along with it. "So, how does this work?" Ben looked at me like I was an idiot. "You just ask it questions, man. It's not rocket science." "All right, fine," I said, adjusting my fingers on the planchette. "Is there anyone here with us?" For a minute, nothing happened. The planchette just sat there, motionless, and I was about to crack a joke about how we must have scared the ghosts away with Jessie's attitude. But then it moved. Not a lot, just a little jerk to the left. We all froze, eyes wide, as we stared at the board. "Ben," Jessie said, her voice more serious now, "are you pushing it?" Ben shook his head, but he was grinning, the kind of grin that suggested he was a little too excited about what was happening. No way. I swear the planchette moved again, slowly this time, gliding toward yes. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I kept telling myself it was just Ben screwing with us. He had to be. "All right, fine," Jessie said, sitting up a little straighter. "Who are you?" The planchette didn't move at first, and I could tell Jessie was about to call it quits, but then it jerked again. Slowly, deliberately, it began spelling something out. We watched as it moved from letter to letter, forming the word Leave. Ben laughed nervously, but I could see the unease starting to creep into his face. "Classic," he muttered. "Real original." But then the planchette started moving again. This time it spelled out STAYAWAFROMTHEBASEMENT. A heavy silence filled the room. We didn't have a basement. At least, we didn't think we did. The house had a small storage room under the stairs, but that was it. It was just an old rental, nothing unusual. Or so we thought. Jessie looked at me, her expression serious now. "Didn't you say something about a weird door under the stairs when we moved in?" I nodded slowly, remembering the small, almost hidden door in the back of the closet under the stairs. We hadn't bothered with it since it was locked, and honestly, it didn't seem like anything worth investigating at the time. "Yeah, but it's probably just some storage space or something, nothing big." Ben's grin faltered, his bravado slipping. "All right, that's creepy, but someone's messing with us. There's no basement, guys. It's probably just..." He stopped mid-sentence, glancing toward the closet door in the hallway, the one that led under the stairs. The atmosphere shifted. The room felt heavier, like the air was thick with something we couldn't see. Jessie was the first to break the silence. "We should check it out," she said, her voice shaking a little. "I mean, if there's no basement, then what's the harm?" I wasn't so sure. Something about this felt off, but curiosity got the better of me. "All right," I said, trying to sound casual. "Let's take a look." We stood up, leaving the Ouija board on the floor as we walked over to the closet. Ben opened the door, and the smell of old wood and dust wafted out. The closet was as I remembered it, dark, small, and cramped, filled with boxes we hadn't bothered to unpack. But at the back, half hidden behind an old coat, was that small, barely noticeable door. Jessie reached for the handle, hesitating for just a second before turning it. Locked. See? Ben said, sounding more confident now. It's nothing. The door doesn't even open. But then, as if in response to his words, we heard it. A faint sound. Muffled, but unmistakable. It was coming from behind the door. It sounded like screaming. We all froze, staring at the door, our breath catching in our throats. There was no way that sound was real. But there it was again, soft, distant, like someone was trapped on the other side, screaming for help. Ben took a step back, his face pale. Nope, I'm out. That's enough for me. But Jessie, always the stubborn one, shook her head. We have to open it. We have to see what's down there. I didn't want to agree with her. Every part of me wanted to bolt out of the house and never look back. But I couldn't. That sound, whatever was behind that door, wasn't going to leave us alone. All right, I said, swallowing hard. Let's find something to open it with. As we searched the house for something to pry the door open, the screaming continued, faint but relentless, like it was echoing from some distant place beneath the floor. My hands were shaking as I grabbed a crowbar from the garage, and by the time I got back to the closet, Jessie was already crouched by the door, her hand resting on the knob like she was waiting for the signal. Ready? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, though I didn't feel ready at all. With a deep breath, I jammed the crowbar into the crack of the door and pushed. The wood groaned, splintering as the door slowly gave way, revealing a narrow, dark staircase leading down into what could only be described as a basement. The smell hit us immediately, musty, damp, like something had been rotting down there for years. But it wasn't the smell that froze us in place. It was the fact that the screaming had stopped. We all stood there, staring down into the narrow stairwell that disappeared into complete darkness. The air coming from below was damp, thick, and it carried a smell that I can only describe as wrong. It wasn't just the musty scent of old wood and dust. There was something else, something sour. It made my stomach turn. The worst part was the silence. The screaming we'd heard, the faint cries from behind the door. It had stopped the moment I pried it open, and that silence felt heavier than the screams ever did. We stood there, not moving, not breathing, just listening to the emptiness. I'm not going down there, Ben said, his voice barely steady. He tried to laugh it off, but it came out weak, forced. I could tell he was just as freaked out as I was, maybe more. Jessie was already moving before either of us could stop her. She grabbed her phone and flicked on the flashlight, shining the weak beam down the stairs. We have to see what's down there, she said, her voice full of nervous determination. We've come this far. I wanted to protest, to tell her we should just shut the door and forget any of this ever happened. But part of me knew we couldn't. The Ouija board, the warning, the screaming. It wasn't just going to stop because we ignored it. Whatever was down there had made itself known, and now it was like we had to see it through. Jessie took the first step, and the wood creaked under her weight, sending an unsettling echo through the space. The beam of her phone barely penetrated the darkness. I could see her shoulders tense as she moved deeper into the stairwell, her hand gripping the railing tightly. Ben looked at me, his face pale, his eyes wide. You really think this is a good idea? No, I muttered, but I followed her anyway. One step at a time, we descended the staircase. Every creak underfoot made my skin crawl, and the air grew colder as we went down. My breath felt heavy in my chest, and the smell grew stronger, like something damp and rotten was waiting for us below. The stairs led us to a small landing, and from there, we stepped into a low-ceilinged basement. The walls were made of old, crumbling stone, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. There were no windows, no light except for the weak glow of our phones, and everything about the space felt wrong. But the most unsettling thing, there was no sign of anyone or anything down there. No source for the screams, no footprints in the dust, just empty space and that terrible silence pressing down on us. "This is weird," Jessie whispered, her phone sweeping over the far wall, revealing an old, rusted furnace in the corner. "I swear we heard something. We all heard it, right?" Ben nodded, but his eyes were locked on the dark corner of the room, like he was expecting something to step out of the shadows. "Yeah, we did. But now it's gone. Let's just get out of here." I wanted to agree with him. The longer we stood in that basement, the worse the atmosphere became. It felt like the walls were closing in on us, like something was watching us from just beyond the reach of the light. Then, Jessie's phone flickered. For a split second, the light cut out, plunging the room into darkness. She let out a sharp gasp, quickly shaking the phone until the light returned. But by then, my heart was already pounding. "Let's go," I said, my voice tight with panic. "This place is giving me the creeps." But Jessie wasn't ready to leave yet. She stepped toward the far wall, the one directly under the stairs, her light scanning the surface. "Wait, what's this?" I followed her gaze and saw what she was looking at. There were scratches. Deep, jagged scratches carved into the stone. It wasn't random. It looked deliberate, almost like claw marks. My stomach dropped when I realized there were dozens of them, all over the wall, as if something had been trapped down here. "I don't like this," Ben whispered, stepping closer to the stairs. "This is too much. We need to go." Jessie leaned in, her fingers brushing over the markings. "These look old, like really old." I opened my mouth to respond, but that's when I heard it. A faint whisper. It wasn't like the screaming from before. This was different, softer, more sinister. A single word carried on the cold air. "Leave." I froze, my blood running cold. Jessie and Ben heard it too. I could tell by the way they both went stiff, their eyes widening in fear. "What was that?" Ben whispered, his voice shaking. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat had gone dry, and every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to get out of that basement as fast as possible. Then the whisper came again, louder this time. "Leave." And that's when we heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow footsteps coming from above us, moving across the floor of the house. It was like someone, or something, was pacing, as if waiting for us to come back upstairs. Jessie's eyes darted toward the stairs. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah," I said, my voice barely audible. "We need to go." We turned to head back up, but the footsteps stopped, replaced by another sound. A soft creaking noise, like a door opening somewhere in the house. Jessie started moving first, her flashlight trembling in her hand as she hurried toward the stairs. Ben and I followed close behind, our nerves shot. The air felt thick with something I couldn't describe. Something wrong, something unnatural. We rushed up the stairs, but as soon as we reached the top, we realized something was different. The living room wasn't how we'd left it. The Ouija board was still on the floor, but the planchette had moved. And now, it was sitting dead center over one word. No. I felt a chill crawl down my spine as we stared at the board. The house was silent again, but that silence didn't feel like safety. It felt like a threat. "What do we do?" Ben asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessie shook her head, her face pale. "I don't know, but I think whatever's in this house, it doesn't want us to leave." And then, as if to confirm her words, we heard it. The screaming. It started again, louder this time, coming from directly beneath us, from the basement we'd just left. But this time, it wasn't distant. It wasn't muffled. It was right beneath our feet. The screaming was so loud, it felt like it was shaking the walls. It was raw and desperate, like someone was in agony just beneath our feet. None of us moved at first. We were all frozen, eyes wide, hearts pounding. My mind was scrambling to make sense of it. We'd just been down there. We hadn't seen anyone, hadn't found anything that could explain the sounds. But here it was again, louder and more intense than before. Jessie was the first to snap out of the paralysis. "What the hell is happening?" Her voice cracked, fear written all over her face. She looked at the door to the basement, then back at me, as if hoping I had an answer. I didn't. None of this made sense. The screams weren't normal. They weren't something we could explain away by blaming old pipes or creaking floorboards. This was something else, something that shouldn't have been there. Ben was pacing now, running his hands through his hair. "We didn't see anything down there," he said, more to himself than to us. "We didn't see anything. So what is that?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know, but it's like whatever's down there is angry." The air in the room felt heavy again, thick with a pressure that made it hard to breathe. It was like the house was waiting for us to make a move, waiting to see what we would do next. Jessie's phone buzzed in her pocket, startling all of us. She pulled it out quickly, her hands trembling as she looked at the screen. "It's dead," she whispered, staring at the black screen. It was at 50% a minute ago. I checked mine. Same thing. The battery had drained completely, as if the house had sucked the life out of it. Ben's phone was dead too. "Okay," I said, trying to take control of the situation. "We need to leave. Whatever's happening here, we're not dealing with it. We just need to get out and..." But as soon as I stepped toward the front door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang, the echo reverberating through the house. I jumped, my heart racing as I stared at the door. There was no wind, no reason it should have closed on its own. Jessie let out a shaky breath. "That's not possible." Ben rushed to the door, yanking on the handle, but it didn't budge. He pulled harder, slamming his shoulder against it, but the door wouldn't open. It was like the house itself was holding it shut. "We're trapped," he muttered, panic rising in his voice. "We're trapped in here." The screaming from the basement had stopped, leaving an eerie, oppressive silence in its wake. I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears as the reality of the situation hit me. The Ouija board, the basement, the screams. It wasn't just random noises or tricks of the mind. Something was in the house with us, and it didn't want us to leave. Jessie turned back toward the living room, her eyes locking onto the Ouija board still lying on the floor. Maybe we need to finish what we started." I didn't want to go near that board again. The warning to stay away from the basement, the way it moved on its own, it had set everything in motion. But deep down, I knew Jessie was right. We hadn't followed the rules. We had ignored the warning, and now it felt like the house was punishing us for it. Ben was shaking his head, backing away from the door. "Number, no way. We're not touching that thing again." Jessie, however, was already walking toward it. "What if we didn't finish? What if that's why this is happening?" I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her we should just wait for the door to open, or that we should try breaking a window, or literally anything other than messing with that board again. But then I remembered the screaming. It wasn't just noise, it was something, or someone, trying to tell us something. Reluctantly, I followed her to the board. Ben stayed back, his face pale, but he didn't stop us. Jessie sat down in front of it, her hands trembling as she placed her fingers on the planchette. I hesitated for a moment before sitting across from her, the weight of what we were doing pressing down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a mistake, that we were playing with something far more dangerous than we realized. But we didn't have a choice. Jessie's voice was barely above a whisper as she asked, "Is there someone here with us?" The planchette didn't move. The house remained silent, the air thick with tension. We waited, holding our breath, but nothing happened. For a moment I thought maybe whatever had been haunting us had given up, that it was done with us. And then slowly, the planchette began to move. Jessie's eyes widened as it slid across the board, stopping on yes. My throat went dry, and I forced myself to ask the next question. "What do you want?" The planchette moved again, this time faster, sliding over the letters. It spelled out one word, B-A-S-E-M-E-N-T. Jessie let out a shaky breath. "It's in the basement." I didn't want to hear that. None of us did. But it was clear. Whatever was down there wasn't going to let us go until we faced it. Maybe we can't ignore it anymore, Jessie said softly, her voice trembling. Maybe it needs us to go down there. No way, Ben snapped, backing further away. You want to walk into that basement after everything that just happened? Are you out of your mind? I didn't blame him for being scared. I was terrified too. But the more we stood there, the more I felt like we didn't have a choice. The house wasn't going to let us leave. The Ouija board wasn't going to stop until we finished what we started. We have to, I said, my voice barely steady. We have to go back down there. Jessie stood up slowly, her face pale but resolute. Ben was shaking his head, but when I looked at him, he didn't argue. He knew it too. We had to face whatever was waiting for us in the basement. The walk back to the door under the stairs felt like the longest walk of my life. Every creak of the floor, every distant sound made my heart race. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on us, like it was alive, like it was watching. We reached the door, and Jessie hesitated for just a second before pulling it open. The dark stairwell yawned before us, the same smell of rot and dampness wafting up from below. Without saying a word, we descended the stairs again, the air growing colder with every step. The deeper we went, the heavier the atmosphere became, like the darkness itself was pressing against our skin. When we reached the bottom, the basement was just as we had left it, dark, empty, silent. But this time, the silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, filled with a tension that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then, from the far corner of the room, we heard it. A soft, rasping breath. Something was down there with us. We all froze as the sound of that soft, rasping breath filled the basement. It came from the far corner, where the shadows seemed thicker, darker than they should have been. The air was thick with a chill that bit into my skin, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, thudding so hard it felt like the whole room could hear it. No one moved. No one breathed. We were all just staring into the darkness, waiting for something to step forward, for something to reveal itself. The only sound was that laboured breathing, slow, deep breaths, like whatever was down here was struggling to hold itself together. Jessie stood closest to the corner, her phone's flashlight trembling in her hand as she pointed it toward the source of the noise. The beam of light flickered, barely cutting through the shadows, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move, just a flicker, something shifting, something alive. "Do you see it?" Jessie whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I wasn't sure what I was seeing. My brain was struggling to process what was in front of us. The light from her phone bounced off the old, crumbling stone walls, revealing nothing but empty space, but I could feel it. There was something there, something lurking just out of sight, hidden by the darkness. Ben took a step back, his breath quickening. "We need to leave. Now." But the door was upstairs, and there was no way we could make it out of here without getting past whatever was breathing in the corner. The basement felt too small, too cramped, like the air itself was pressing in on us. Jessie, her face pale but determined, took a step forward. "If we don't face it, it's not going to stop." "Jessie, no," I whispered, reaching out to grab her arm, but she shook me off. "We've come this far," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't turn back now." I wanted to argue, to beg her to just run, to forget this ever happened, but something deep inside me knew she was right. The house wasn't going to let us go unless we faced whatever was waiting for us down here. I didn't know if it was something from the Ouija board or something darker, something that had always been here, but it wasn't going to stop until we confronted it. Jessie moved closer to the corner, the light from her phone flickering as she stepped into the thickest part of the shadows. Ben and I hung back, too terrified to move any closer, but we couldn't leave her to face it alone. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaky but clear. What do you want?" For a moment, the only response was the sound of that slow, labored breathing. It seemed to grow louder, filling the room with a weight that pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Then, from the darkness, a voice. It was barely more than a whisper, raspy and broken, like the words were being dragged out of someone who hadn't spoken in years. "Help! Me!" My stomach twisted, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. That voice, it was so human, so desperate, but there was something else underneath it, something wrong. The words echoed through the basement, bouncing off the walls, and I could feel the cold crawling up my spine, gripping me in place. Jessie's face went pale, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't move. "Who are you?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "Why are you here?" The voice came again, louder this time, angrier. "Help! Me! Please!" The last word seemed to stretch out, lingering in the air like it was clinging to us, pulling us deeper into the darkness. Jessie stepped back, her hand shaking, the light from her phone flickering as if the darkness itself was trying to swallow it. "We can't help you," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "We don't know how." Ben was shaking his head, backing away toward the stairs. "This is wrong. We need to leave. Now." But just as he said that, the temperature in the room dropped even further. The air turned icy, biting into my skin like I'd stepped into a freezer. My breath came out in white puffs, and I could see Jessie's shaking hand as she struggled to keep the light steady. Then, from the corner of the room, the shadows began to shift. Slowly at first, then faster, like something was writhing just beneath the surface, something trying to break free. The rasping breath grew louder, more ragged, and then a figure stepped out of the darkness. It was tall, too tall for the low-ceilinged basement. Its body hunched and twisted as it moved forward. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched too tightly over bones that jutted out at odd angles. Its eyes were hollow, deep black pits that seemed to drink in the light, and its mouth hung open, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The thing in front of us was impossible, something that shouldn't exist, something straight out of a nightmare. But there it was, standing just feet away, its hollow eyes locked on us. Jessie stumbled back, her voice catching in her throat. What are you?" The creature didn't answer. It just stared at us, its breath rasping, filling the room with that horrible sound. Then slowly its mouth began to move, forming words that sent chills down my spine. "You should have stayed away." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. The warning from the Ouija board. The warning to stay away from the basement. We had ignored it, and now we were standing face to face with whatever was haunting this house. Ben was already halfway up the stairs, his eyes wide with panic. "We have to go. Now!" Jessie and I turned to follow him, but just as we reached the bottom of the stairs, the creature let out a scream. It wasn't like the screaming we'd heard before. It was louder, more primal, like the sound of a wild animal in pain. The noise echoed through the basement, shaking the walls, and I felt my legs go weak as fear flooded my body. I grabbed Jessie's arm, pulling her up the stairs as fast as we could go, Ben already ahead of us. We stumbled up the narrow stairwell, tripping over our own feet as the scream followed us, filling the house with that horrible, ear-piercing sound. We burst through the door at the top of the stairs, slamming it shut behind us. The house was silent again, but the air was still thick with that sense of dread, that feeling that something was watching us, waiting. We didn't stop running until we were out the front door, standing in the cold night air, gasping for breath. The house loomed behind us, dark and silent, but we knew better now. We knew what was down there. Jessie leaned against the car, her face pale, her body shaking. What the hell was that? I shook my head, my heart still pounding in my chest. "I don't know, but we're never going back down there." Ben nodded, his face white as a sheet. We never should have messed with that board. We never should have ignored the warning. None of us argued. We knew the truth now. The Ouija board hadn't been lying. We should have stayed away from the basement, because something was still down there. And it wasn't done with us yet. We stood outside, the cold night air biting at our skin, but none of us moved. It was like we were waiting for something, waiting to see if the house would do anything else. My heart was still racing, the adrenaline pumping through my veins, making it hard to think clearly. All I knew was that we had barely escaped, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not yet. Jessie broke the silence first, her voice shaking. We should leave. Get as far away from here as we can. Ben nodded, his eyes still locked on the house. I'm with her. Let's just go. We can figure out what to do later, but I'm not sticking around to see what that thing does next. I wanted to agree, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I couldn't explain it, but there was this gnawing feeling in the back of my mind, something telling me that leaving wouldn't solve anything. The thing in the basement, it wasn't going to let us walk away that easily. Jessie must have seen the look on my face because she frowned. You're not seriously thinking of going back in there, are you? No, I said quickly, though my voice betrayed the uncertainty I was feeling. But I don't think it's done with us. We disturbed something down there, something that's been trapped for a long time. Jessie shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. And what do you think it's going to do? Follow us? Haunt us? Ben shook his head, pacing nervously. We shouldn't have gone into that basement. We shouldn't have messed with the Ouija board. It's like we broke something, and now... He trailed off, glancing back at the house as if expecting the thing to come bursting out of the front door at any second. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew he was right. We had broken something, crossed a line we never should have crossed. And now, whatever was in that house wasn't going to just let us walk away. Then, as if to confirm our worst fears, the front door of the house creaked open. We all turned, staring in horror as the door slowly swung wide, revealing the dark interior of the house. The air seemed to grow colder, sharper, as though the house itself was daring us to come back in, daring us to face whatever was waiting for us in the basement. We're not going back in, Ben said quickly, backing away. No way. But as soon as the words left his mouth, we heard it again, the screaming. This time, it wasn't faint or muffled. It wasn't coming from deep within the house. It was loud, echoing through the empty doorway, like the sound was being funneled directly toward us. And it wasn't just one voice, it was multiple. Men, women, even children, screaming in pain, begging for help. My skin prickled with fear, and I took a step back, instinctively pulling away from the house. But the screaming didn't stop. It grew louder, more intense, as if the house itself was alive with the sound of agony. What? What is that? Jessie stammered, her eyes wide with terror. I didn't have an answer. I didn't even know if I could form words at that moment. All I knew was that the house wanted us back inside. And the voices wanted something from us. Then, through the chorus of screams, we heard it again. That same voice we'd heard in the basement. Soft, raspy, and desperate. Help. Us. I felt my stomach turn. That voice wasn't just some random ghost or spirit trapped in the house. It was real. And whatever was in that basement, whatever had been there for all these years, it was still trapped. Still suffering. We can't leave them, I whispered, more to myself than to anyone else. Jessie whipped around to face me, her expression incredulous. What do you mean we can't leave them? Are you hearing yourself right now? We have to do something, I said, my voice growing steadier, despite the fear gnawing at my insides. We woke it up. We're part of this now. No way, Ben said, shaking his head vigorously. We're not going back in there. That thing, whatever it is, isn't something we can help. Jessie's hands were trembling as she spoke, but her voice was firm. He's right. We can't help. We need to leave. Now. But as soon as she finished speaking, the screams stopped. All at once, like someone had cut the sound off with a switch. The sudden silence was almost worse, thick and oppressive, pressing down on us like a weight. I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears as we all stood there, staring at the open doorway, waiting for whatever came next. Then, from the shadows of the house, a figure appeared. At first, I thought it was the same creature we'd seen in the basement, but as it stepped into the weak light spilling from the street lamp, I realized it was different. Smaller. Human. It was a little girl. She looked like she was maybe 7 or 8, dressed in an old-fashioned white dress that was stained with dirt and grime. Her hair hung limp around her face, and her eyes, empty, hollow, locked onto mine. She raised a hand, beckoning us toward her. "Please," she whispered, her voice carrying on the wind. "Help us." I felt frozen in place, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but I couldn't. It didn't make sense. None of this made sense. The girl took a step forward, her bare feet making no sound on the porch. Her hand was still outstretched, her face pale and expressionless. But her eyes, those empty eyes, they seemed to bore into my soul, filling me with a deep, aching dread. Jessie grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "We're leaving, now." But I couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off the girl. There was something about her, something so wrong, yet so compelling, like she was both a victim and part of whatever horror the house was hiding. "We can't leave," I whispered again, my voice hoarse. "Not until we figure out what happened." Jessie shook her head furiously. "There's nothing to figure out. We're leaving." But then, as if in response to her words, the girl's face twisted into a smile, a slow, unnatural grin that spread across her face like a crack in porcelain. "Stay," she whispered, her voice dark and distorted. "Stay with us." The door slammed shut. The house fell silent again, and in that moment, I knew. We hadn't just stumbled into some haunted house. We had walked into something much worse. We had opened a door that couldn't be closed, and whatever was in that house, whatever was in the basement, it wasn't just after us. It wanted to keep us, forever.